And we are recording. Let me get my screen back up here. Okay, can folks see my screen without my notes, hopefully? So thanks for being here today for this afternoon. I'm really excited about our presentation / workshop today, Housing is a Human Right. And thanks for taking time out of your day to be here. We will do a round of quick introductions. I think we have nearly all of our speakers here today. So my name is Tammy Kresnar. I use she, her pronouns. I'm an organizing program associate out of ACLU of Northern California. And I will pass it over to KD.
Good afternoon. Thanks again, everyone, for spending your lunch hours and your afternoon with us. I am Katie Dixon. I go by KD. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm an organizer with the ACLU of Northern California, and I am glad to be here. Thank you. I'm going to kick it to...
I don't know if Lethal is on yet, so we can go to Eve.
Hey everyone, it's so great to be here. My name is Eve Garrow. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a senior policy analyst and advocate with the ACLU of Southern California. And I'm not sure who to send it to next.
I think we can send it to Brandon.
Okay, Brandon.
There we go. Brandon Greene, he, him, his. I direct the Racial and Economic Justice Program at the ACLU of Northern California.
Diana?
Hi, my name is Diana Monroy. My pronouns are they, them. I specifically work as a mentor and as an advocate for youth experiencing homelessness and housing instability, and just a street outreach and advocacy.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks for your patience as we figure out our muting and unmuting here. Okay, so some quick Zoom safety tips, and I think Sierra is gonna make sure that these are correct. So you cannot rename yourself, and just to minimize background noise, you cannot unmute yourself. So you can ask staff to unmute you, or if you raise your hand, we can unmute you, but just to minimize background noise, that's how our Zoom safety is set up for today. And then closed captioning can be accessed by clicking the closed caption bottom at the bottom of your screen. And we do have Spanish interpretation available today. So pueden acceder la interpretación en español haciendo clic en interpretation en la parte inferior de la pantalla y seleccionando Spanish. And Mario is here today to do interpretation for us. So thank you to Mario. So we would like to begin today with a land acknowledgement, as we do in many of our ACLU events. And we want to acknowledge that all of the land in currently what is known as the United States is unceded indigenous territory, and that here in California, we are on the occupied land of over 100 tribes. We recognize the painful history upon which our state exists, including state-sanctioned and state-funded genocide, displacement and dispossession of ancestral lands, removal of children from their families, and laws that seek to erase Indigenous peoples altogether. And hopefully one of my colleagues can put a link into the chat where you can learn more about the Indigenous land that you are on. I also want to acknowledge that taking time for this during our presentation is just one small step, but it's not a replacement for real transformative allyship with Indigenous communities. And we encourage you to support Indigenous-led work and research what is happening in your own communities on Indigenous-led campaigns. We're also here today to talk about land and how access to land has been wielded as a tool to decide who has power in our society and who does not. And our country was founded on racialized discriminatory policies deciding who gets to own land and who does not, who gets to live in a home and who doesn't. And those policies aren't just history, they are relevant to our present situation and our discussion of how people have been displaced from their homes and how to advocate for long-term, affordable, or free housing for all. So at this point, I am going to turn it over to Diana, who's going to share a poem and some reflections. And this is a beautiful but heartbreaking tribute. So I want to encourage folks to just take care as Diana is speaking, and I'll pull the slides down for now.
Hi, thanks for having me. Really quickly, trigger warning around gun violence. So yes, please take care of yourself if you need to. I'm really grateful to get to introduce you to someone today, because that's what we're here for, right? We're here together to talk about homelessness. We're not here to talk about statistics and numbers. We're talking about our friends, our family members, our loved ones, our community, our neighbors. I've lived and worked in many places, but one of the things that stayed true is the ruthless nature of the criminalization of poverty. And the harm that I can't even really begin to tell you the harm that I've witnessed, but I can begin by saying that police brutality does not take life in just one moment. It also takes it over the years of endless and experienced harassment by our unhoused neighbors and others. And so today, I'm going to read a piece that I read at the memorial of my dear friend, who I can say lost his life to this constant barrage of harassment. I remember the first time I met John standing in Rick's old backyard. He was surrounded by all kinds of plants that he cared for, chickens clucking in the background, clothes hanging on the line, being warmed by the sun. His rough hands handing each person in my family a fruit that we'd never seen before. The impossibly sweet, and I thought here, this possibly sweet taste of a sugar plum spread in our mouths like a small miracle. And I thought here is proof that a different way of life is not only possible, but so much more than I thought it could be. John was constantly opening new doors to worlds I'd never experienced before, everything more exciting than the last. He would scoop us up on Jerusalem artichoke harvesting expeditions and to unwittingly invade people's chicken coops. He taught us how to make friends with bees and how to turn one plant into a million. He was the bringer of giant squashes and oh so rich cakes, and we spent hours at the kitchen table nibbling on chocolate and sipping on coffee and talking about ways to jiggy rig this and that until we had solved all the world's energy issues under yellow electric lights. There are a million different words that I could use to describe John, but after everything is said and done, he was my friend, a member of my family, someone who inspired me one minute and frustrated me the next, someone that made me feel just a little less lonely in this world and a lot more loved. I was so hungry and grateful for an elder like John in my life, someone who was always learning, reading, trying something new. There was the kind of excitement and wonder in his eyes that most of us struggle to hold on to past childhood. I think that's what I'll remember the most about John. His eyes, a mixture of excitement and sadness that told of life infinitely long and full of experiences. That in his rough, calloused hands, earth perpetually under the nails. There's so much of humanity in his eyes and hands, so many stories in the lines and wrinkles. John rarely talked about his childhood at length, but when he did, I clung on to every word, wanting to get some sense of this man as a boy. I saw myself in some of his stories. Someone who found themselves in a family, in a place, in a culture that didn't quite have a place for him, in the searching for something different, something more. Some part of me truly hopes and wants to believe that he found at least part of what he was searching for in our family, in our community, in all of us, that he was valued and seen and loved just as he was. So my dear friend, who had lived out of his car for a number of years, had experienced decades of harassment from the police, until one day, the police decided that they'd had enough, and they threatened to impound his house, which was his car, which was his house, his only safety. And they made this nearly 70-year-old man lie face down on the concrete in the middle of winter. And this was too much for him, to have the only place he called home being threatened. And so he ran to the car and he pulled out a gun we didn't know he had, and he shot himself. And he survived this only barely. And we spent the next 6 months caring for what was left of him out of our own resources, because there was hardly any for him. And this is what I mean by the way in which our unhoused neighbors are constantly put under an immense amount of stress to the point of breaking. And it's more than just these one single moments, right? And so I hope for his sake that we find some real solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. Can we put some love and admiration and virtual hugs and everything into the chat? That was so beautiful, so moving. I think that what you just said of like that, maybe you can send it around later, but like the mixture of like sadness and love that you saw in his eyes. And I feel like that just like captures it so beautifully. And I think you sharing a little bit of John with us is a gift today. So
Thank you, Diana.
thank you. Let's put some love into the chat for that. Lethal, I know that you are here today, and I know that your time might be a little bit limited, so I will ask for forgiveness from the rest of our speakers today, and might switch things around so that we can accommodate Lethal's schedule. So if someone can make Lethal a co-host so that she can unmute herself. Lethal does outreach and advocacy within Fresno on a very community-based scale. And so I wanted to invite Lethal here today so that you could maybe think about how to apply some of the work that Lethal is doing in her community into your own community, and start thinking about what supplies folks might need, or how you can really be supporting folks in your own cities and communities, because we all have a role to play here. So Lethal, I think you are unmuted right now. I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. My name is Lethal Garcia. I'm a 34-year-old queer Chicana, and I reside in the land of the Yokuts, which is now known as Fresno, California. I am secretary of Navigating Structures, which is a local organization that focuses on people who are disabled and are homeless or at risk of homelessness. I live with depression, PTSD, and fibromyalgia myself. I have been running outreach since May 2018, and in the last 2 years, I have been actively advocating for my local street family members by helping coordinate protests, offer social services, attend city council, and ultimately working through my anxiety by adding my public comments in chambers rather through emails. My first memories are of living with family in my grandparents' barn and playing hide and seek with cousins and siblings, not knowing that I would struggle with being homeless and at risk of homelessness for the rest of my life. We had stints of being housed, but we stayed living on floors, couches, and hotels from the time I was in the 6th grade to my sophomore year of high school. My first period was in a hotel that we stayed in for a week during my first summer of homelessness. A lot of the trauma from living with strangers, living with family on their couches, and living in hotels is still with me today. The last time I experienced homelessness, I was pregnant, and then again when my son was a year old. I bounced from many family members' floors and shared beds, and had exactly zero resources given to me to make things better for myself, but public assistance. The anxiety from the past still haunts me today because my shelter is always at jeopardy due to a vindictive and spiteful landlord, something that many people on the streets know all too well because of unlawful evictions, that they didn't know how to advocate for themselves on, or rent being raised. I developed fibromyalgia at the age of 19, and it had major impacts on me physically, mentally, and spiritually, which in turn helped lead me into alcohol abuse. Addiction was something I knew all too well. I grew up around it because my whole family uses due to poverty, childhood trauma, learning disabilities, etc. I was still making it work though, and I went to college and began teaching preschool. I struggled with my depression, fibromyalgia, alcohol use, and anxiety, but I was doing my best to make it work. When my abusive relationship hit its peak, though, I fell off and discontinued working October 2016. I was told I now had PTSD. It was a long road and enduring abuse and mental hospital stays and trying to cope with the person PTS was turning me to be. Hi, Kitty. I just, I hear similar stories from my unhoused sisters where they too were raped and abused and left to try to make ends meet with their children. I began to see for myself how they were me. They were my mother and everyone else I grew up around, with a multitude of things being flung at them due to their housing circumstances and an oppressive system that is built to keep people poor. My Grammy passing away in 2017 kind of damned my mother to be homeless again, because it was in the will that the house was to be split 4 ways. My mother and I never got along well, and she had battled with addiction and depression her whole life. Once we both had developed PTSD and I took her in so she wouldn't be on the streets, I quickly noticed that she triggered my alcoholism, and my personal space, my son's home, no longer felt like a safe place. I brought her around for a few rounds of unhealthy stays, but I ultimately stopped trying to shelter her for my son's well being. I continued to support her, and I would travel across town almost every evening to bring food, water, and whatever else it was that she was asking me for. She was with my stepdad at the time, living in a tent. In the beginning, I was pulling from my own resources and just hustling from Facebook or OfferUp. I soon realized I didn't want to stop at helping my mom, and I began buying cases of water for her whole street and ultimately the entire Skid Row. I started to buy cutlery, paper plates, gloves, foil, and saving brown grocery bags to serve home cooked meals out of the trunk of my car with the help of my 8-year-old. As I hooked up with other local advocates and started seeing for myself the political aspect of what I'm doing, I began to ask people for their specific needs, and asking for donations, because I saw that the local Poverello house here where I reside was running super meager outreach, though they rack in grants from the city and millions from private investors. This is when I knew I had to step up my game for the street family, and I set up my own Cash App and Venmo. As I've been fostering cats since 2017 just because I love them, but I began taking in homeless pets last year. I took in 6 to 8 from a camp that was half displaced, half sheltered, and 4 others that went uh, into they were sent to Sacramento to a rescue. I currently have 4 kittens right now from a camp. They all have eye infections, so I took them in. I'm going to foster them, and they'll be housed as well. But in February and early March, I don't remember, I took on my first dog services, helping Polly and about 5 other dogs get to a mobile clinic that specifically serves homeless pets. One of these dogs was spayed, mind you. They're all loved. They're family. This is how I knew I had to help give them the care they needed, so that my street brothers and sisters didn't have to run into a snag because of not having shots or unwanted pregnancies. I firmly believe the best helpers and advocates for the unhoused community comes from people with lived experiences. You just have to know what it's like being in their shoes to fully be empathetic to their situation and needs. I have had many of my own experiences with addiction, homelessness, food insecurity, domestic violence, racism, and being a person with invisible disabilities and mental health issues. Not to mention, I'm queer. That being said, simply finding the best deals on cases of water or keeping a box of Nutri-Grain bars in your car is always thoughtful and sometimes goes a long way for someone who may not have had food or water in days. I always keep fast food napkins and reserve unwearable old clothing for people to use as wash rags. And I keep a bag of bags in my vehicle because they're always in need of bags for their belongings, but most importantly, trash. So those are a few of the ideas that I have off the top of my head that anybody can really do. So thank you for allowing me to share with you my passion. for the unhoused community. It's been an honor. And, as long as you have your head and heart in it, you can do it. Si se puede.
Thank you so much, Lethal. And if you don't mind me putting you on the spot, like if I'm someone who is interested in, being able to provide food or supplies or what folks need in my own community, like what's advice that you would give to folks about how to do that and how to do it in a way that is loving and caring?
Like I said, just keep a few simple things in the vehicle. Extra grocery bags, plastic bags, keep bags on you, keep the fast food napkins. Like I'll keep them all on my door. And when I see people, sometimes they'll see it before I mention it. They'll be like, "Oh, can I have those napkins?" Hell yeah, take them. Um, get a case of water, put it in your trunk. You see someone, give them a water or two. They have an animal, make sure the animal gets a water too. Just keeping a little box of Nutri-Grain bars or little fruit snacks, or maybe a little bag of oranges or something that you can give out, within a day or two, I think is always pretty simple. It's pretty easy to just kind of keep a few things in your car and just, pass it out when you see someone.
Thank you. Thank you, Lethal, for that, and uplifting what Josefa put into the chat. Such crucial work advocates do locally with little to no support. So I want to put an ask out there to everyone who's here today that like a lot of this is just like a simple Google as well. Like if you can put in your time and you have, what Lethal said of like a few extra dollars for some food supplies for folks or other things, but a simple Google can also lead you to, oh, hi, Kitty. A simple Google can lead you to like Facebook groups where people are collecting money and supplies, and it's so necessary in this. And thank you for showing us this adorable kitty. For folks who know me, I'm like an animal person, so I'll never say no to seeing a cat on a Zoom. And that's a really critical part of what you're doing too, is like, supporting, the whole ecosystem, including pets who are in our care as well.
Yeah, definitely. The cops come in and they'll throw everything away. It'll be a bag of dog food, it'll be insulin. They don't care if you're even asking, "Hey, can I have that piece of paper? I need my birth certificate."
Yeah.
So the animal services is always super important. Don't get me wrong, they get taken care of before the street brothers and sisters do, but it's always, if we take care of their animals, they'll have their baby just that much longer. And that's important for me because I love my cats.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lethal, for sharing and for being here today. And for anyone who's in Fresno or maybe beyond, Lethal, if you wanted to put anything into the chat for how folks can support you, even if they're outside of Fresno, I welcome you to do that. So I am going to bring back our slides here today. So thank you to Diana and thank you to Lethal for being here today. I think what Diana and what Lethal shared have sort of borne out like what our communities really need here. And that's why we sort of wanted to invite Diana and Lethal, but also to talk about what our vision really is for housing justice. Sometimes we get asked, like, as the ACLU, why is this something that we're working on? And we believe that economic justice, housing justice, and racial justice are intrinsically connected, and that without basic economic security, without the knowledge that you have a bed to sleep in, food to feed yourself and your family, without the fear that you will be prosecuted because you are experiencing poverty, one cannot be free to exercise our civil rights. And as the ACLU, we believe in investments in our needs, that every single person, regardless of our financial status, has our basic human needs met, but also that we can live with dignity. And our North Star is a human right for a place to call a home, a fundamental right to housing. And I have my screen up, so I can't read the chat, but as I'm talking through this, I invite you to imagine what that would be like. How would our lives be different if everyone had access to a home that they could afford? What would that look like if we could imagine a world where people who have been displaced from housing were provided with a permanent, affordable solution. And in some ways, it is an exercise in imagination because that is very different from the world that we have right now. So achieving that fundamental right to housing will involve investment in subsidized housing that is truly affordable. And one of the things necessary to ensure that funding is sustained is an equitable tax structure. It's part of the reason why we've advocated to close tax loopholes that just favor wealthy corporations, which always come at the expense of providing housing and other critical services to our communities. And at the same time, we have to end policies that make it a crime to be unhoused. We have to, not just simply tell local governments to do better, because oftentimes they won't, even if that's what we tell them, but we have to provide an alternative solution, and that's long-term affordable housing. We have to fight the narrative that blames the victims of our affordable housing crisis instead of who's really at the center, and that's special interests with lots of money and elected leaders who are representing them. So in all of this work, we have to combat the commonly told story that scapegoats the people that are at the very center of the housing crisis and puts the blame on them for our current situation. So at this point, I will turn it over to Brandon Greene and Eve Garrow to talk a little bit about the history of racialized criminalization policies and how we've sort of landed here in our current situation. So I will turn it over to you all.
Thank you, Tammy. So I'll just quickly, this was alluded to in the sort of intro, but I think it's important just to note that, everything we think about housing, land ownership, who can and cannot access it, who is or who's not seen as a trespasser or someone who is seen as welcome has always been racialized. We started this particular discussion with land acknowledgement. And, if we think about how indigenous peoples occupied land and what their conception of ownership was, it was more of a communal model, right? And one of the things that was introduced that continues to have ramifications now was this notion of individual ownership, which over time made it so that plots of land that had generally been owned by the tribe were divided up and then therefore could be either sold or taken or et cetera. A very similar conception happened with the Gullah Geechee people who are one of the only communities of Black Americans that were able to keep part of their culture sort of post-slavery. And that same sort of communal model existed. And, this sort of individualized notions of home ownership have been utilized to take land from them. This dovetails with what we know about some of the convict leasing laws and vagrancy laws that were passed after slaves were freed, where freed slaves were seen or criminalized rather for trespassing and being vagrant, walking the land. This comes into more sharp focus when we think about sort of racially restrictive covenants, some of which still exist in San Francisco, for example. Some buildings, some homes, some enclaves have still been found to have some of these racially restrictive covenants, which made it so that it was illegal to sell homes to Black people. And the reason these things are important to note is because currently both in the national scope and in the various local jurisdictions, homelessness disproportionately impacts Black people and people of color. Nationwide, it's about 40% of all unhoused folks are Black. And in California, you know, it varies by jurisdiction, but it's somewhere between 20 and 30%, for example. And these things are not accidental, right? The racialized wealth gap is something that continues to grow. Black communities and other communities of color are disproportionately entangled in the criminal legal system, the foster care system, all of these things that we know are on-ramps to homelessness. And we know that, you know, for example, if you have a Black enclave of homes, and you have a large concentration of Black folks who live there, even if they make the same amount of money as their white counterparts, just by virtue of having that many Black people or other people of color, like those homes will be deflated in value, right? And so now we're seeing all sorts of things come to or crash into each other. For example, in Oakland, where the Black population has been lowered by 30% roughly over the last 10 years. And in taking that city as example, Black folks are disproportionately impacted by housing burden, rental burden, et cetera. And so it's been very important for me in our work and for our team to really sort of conceptualize housing justice as a racial justice issue, and to really think about the ways in which who we are talking about being unhoused, Black people, people of color, Indigenous people, et cetera, also ends up resulting in some of the solutions that are pushed, which is typically more stigmatization, more criminalization, more push out, et cetera. Next slide, please.
And Diana, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, are you ready for me?
Yes, yes.
Like I said at the beginning, yeah, I work with specifically youth experiencing homelessness and housing instability. So I'm going to be speaking from that perspective. One of the elements that we often fail to address when we talk about homelessness is specifically youth homelessness. And this is partially because these youth are mostly invisible. Youth homelessness often looks very, very different from what we think of as adult homelessness. Some youth have the ability to temporarily stay at like a person's house, couch surf, while others stay out of sight on the margins of our city for safety reasons, right? This all leads to the numbers being way, way off when we do our annual counts of how many people are experiencing homelessness, even more so than maybe other demographics. We estimate that only about 1/4 of youth are actually being represented on these statistics, if not less. So dangerously, people assume that youth homelessness is not a real issue. And that's incredibly problematic for a lot of different reasons, but I'm going to focus on one here, which is that 70% of chronically homeless adults had their first experience being unhoused in their youth. That's between the ages of like 16 and 25, or even younger. 70%. That's a huge number. These are youth running away from physically abusive situations, like 46%, right? Mentally abusive situations, 38% sexually abusive situations, 17% rape reported. A devastating number of these youth are kicked out of their homes for being LGBTQ. And we all know that these are undercounted numbers. It's almost a joke to mention them here. From personal experience, both as a former homeless youth and a current mentor and youth advocate, these are the majority of the youth that I'm actually seeing and working with, right? They're coming from incredibly traumatizing situations only to be faced with the trauma that inevitably comes with being unhoused, whether that's further victimization, stress and exposure, or the ceaseless engine that is police harassment. 50% of misdemeanors booked at Sac County Jail are due to housing instability. 50%, that's insane to think about. So what does this mean for us as a community? It means we have an amazing opportunity to drastically decrease the number of folks who end up chronically homeless by addressing it from the very beginning, before street trauma occurs and the addiction cycles that come with it, before the carceral system gets its claws into them and creates even more barriers. By putting the youth at the front of our action planning, we can have a huge impact not only on them, but our communities as a whole, right? Everyone experiencing unhousedness. And this can look like, first and foremost, providing permanent long-term housing. That's what we're here for. But also, these youth need a ladder. And we can give that to them by also funding transitional youth housing, which are programs that provide holistic support of our young people, the kind of holistic support that they need to become independent, ones that provide job and housing counseling, as well as mental health programs. These are the kinds of programs I work with and in. We also need flexible funding that can be used to pay rent to renters or family members in order to give our youth one more rung on that ladder of independence. And in order to connect our youth to all of these resources, getting them into permanent housing as soon as possible, I am hearing for people working in San Joaquin on the ground that we do need youth-specific, safe, low barrier, immediate shelters for those first few nights, especially for our young women. Trans women especially are vulnerable to violence on the streets, as well as LGBTQ plus youth as a whole. And finally, I can't stress this one enough. We need mental health services to support them through it all. The policies we make and support and the orgs can have a huge impact on our youth and the adults they'll become. So I ask you to please not allow them to be forgotten. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. So I wanted to transition a little bit to Eve and Brandon to talk about like how we got here over the past few decades and how that's led to our current situation as well. Eve?
Right, thank you, Tammy. So here's just like a little timeline. And as you read through this, I think there's a couple of things that I want, that I hope become clear. The first one is that, you know, when Tammy talked about the right to housing, right? A lot of people think like, wow, that's weird. What would that be like? That's like super innovative, but it's not. I mean, we know what to do. We know that, you know, rights are enforced and upheld by the government through our tax dollars, and that an equitable tax structure that, you know, fully funds the housing program, the affordable housing programs that we have now would uphold the right to housing, right? Like we already have these programs. We have housing choice vouchers. We have project-based housing. We have these programs. It's just, as we're going to talk about a little bit later, they're so underfunded that people cannot access them. I also want to point out here that the lack of affordable housing and the government's failure to respect people's right to housing is really a political decision, as you can see here, and it's a form of structural violence. So let's just like, you know, like quickly, from about the Great Depression, where, you know, all of these like new programs through the New Deal were a response to the widespread needs that were that the Depression created. And it was like really one of the first times in our nation's history that social welfare programs were started to become developed in a serious way and were fully funded. And public housing was part of that, of the New Deal programs. By 1970, so between the 1930s and the early 70s, there was a lot of production of affordable housing. Think about this, there were 1 million more units of affordable housing available than households that needed it. And houselessness at that point was relatively rare because housing was, affordable housing was actually available to people. But the Reagan administration was really an inflection point for this country when it came to the production of affordable housing. The Reagan administration then slashes federal funding for subsidized affordable housing by 80%. It almost completely eliminates our federal affordable housing programs. And that was obviously a political decision. And when you think about like, well, if those revenues were then not being used for housing, where were they? Well, they show up in the form of tax cuts for the wealthy, right? So this starts our modern day shift, neoliberal shift towards, shifting, social needs onto the market. You either can afford market rate housing or you go houseless, right? And taking and concentrating wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer people. By the 1990s, the government starts raising public housing developments, and few of them are replaced. So just sort of like worsens the issue. And then by 1998, an act was passed that prohibited public funding for the development of new public housing units. I just also want to take a moment, and maybe Brandon wants to chime in, that as stark as this issue is, there is one caveat. Our affordable, because we live in a racist society, our affordable housing programs have also always been sort of like racialized and gendered, and it wasn't like these programs were perfect. They tended to segregate, poor communities of color, and or like reinforce those forms of segregation and things like that. I also, though, on the flip side, want to say that the disappearance or the slashing of these programs was also justified by Reagan himself and the Reagan administration, using like highly racialized and gendered tropes, right? Such as the trope of the welfare queen. So, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to those thoughts, Brandon.
No, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, none of the New Deal programs were squarely targeted at Black folks, for example, though Black folks benefited from some of them, even as like discrimination at the local level still was persistent. But it was helpful for everyone, though, again, Black folks weren't sort of top of mind for any of those programs. It was helpful in preventing some of the displacement and other things that we see currently.
Yeah, I agree. And so I think one of the lessons there, like when we look back at history and when we look at what's going on today, is that as we fight for rights, we have to recognize that within a racialized a nation with such a strong history of racial discrimination that continues to this day, that we have to just remain constantly vigilant and recognize that that unless we're vigilant, those policies will also be racialized in a way that negatively disproportionately impacts our Black people and our communities of color. We can move on to the next slide. Just kind of like going back to something, next slide. Oh, sorry. So just, also kind of thinking about something that Lethal said, when one of the first things that she said in, when she was talking about her organizing, is the fact that they engage in protest. And if this is a political problem, the solution is also political, right? And then going back to what Tammy said about how we deflect and these realities by stigmatizing and scapegoating folks who are, let's say unhoused, or people, who live in subsidized housing, for example, are ways to depoliticize the issue, right? I mean, they are tools that interest groups that are benefiting off of our unjust and unequal system weaponize and use to depoliticize these issues which, in order to prevent the kind of organizing that we need to do, the kind of mobilization that we need to do in order to, fight for our human rights. So in recent decades, things hasn't gotten any better. And I want to just underscore that this means, through Republican as well as Democratic administrations, things have just gotten worse. So between 2005 and 2015, housing choice vouchers, which are like our primary form of affordable housing now, and project-based vouchers, the number of vouchers stayed about the same during that decade. And so there was like no new affordable housing. And so that now, like, affordable housing, our federal affordable housing programs are available to only about a quarter of all eligible households. Now, remember, back in 1970, there were actually more affordable housing opportunities than there were people who are eligible. And now these opportunities are available to only a small fraction of all households. And of course, like those vouchers, those units stay occupied, right? And so the lists become very long because somebody has to either die or, become ineligible and move out for another person to be able to take advantage of that opportunity. And then like some of these other programs, which I won't go into, which also have provided funding for affordable housing, have suffered major declines, at least 50%, right, over the last, decade or two. So we can go on, I think, to the next slide. And so what's happening now? Affordable housing is actually, so, in the interim, over these past 40 or 50 years, that we have essentially just decimated our affordable housing programs. Market rate housing has become increasingly unattainable, right? Pushing more and more people out onto the streets or into crowded, housing situations, living in their cars, all of the things that we've heard about today. And how long do people have to wait, on wait lists? Well, I'm just going to give you an example, and then I think that KD is going to share some of her personal experience. So I'm going to give you one anecdote from Los Angeles, but this is not this is not unusual. This is not actually an outlier, at least for California, which, by the way, is sort of it's ground zero for houselessness in the United States, right? I mean, the problem here is dire. So Los Angeles City, for the most part, people can never even get on the waiting list. So even if you qualify for affordable housing, the list is closed. So it's completely unobtainable to you. So in the city of LA, the list stayed closed for 13 years. And then it opened for 2 weeks in 2017. But they didn't in that 2-week period, they didn't let everybody who applied onto that list, right? Because that would have been too many people. So they let 20,000 people enter the list by lottery. They had a lottery. And so 20,000 people were lucky enough who knew about the 2-week, window, and made it through the lottery, were lucky enough to get on that list. And so then how long could they expect to wait to get to the top of the list and actually have access to affordable housing? Another 11 years. So that's like an entire generation that people, if they're really staying on top of it and they know what's going on with their local housing authorities and whatever, would be able to navigate the system and actually get to the top of a list and then actually have subsidized affordable housing, right? So this is really, this is where we are now. And this is really the source of our houselessness and housing insecurity problems in California today. And KD, I don't know if you want to like share a little bit of your own personal experience.
Just real quick, even if you get one of those vouchers, you know, in LA, for example, something like 75% of landlords won't accept vouchers. And you only have a certain amount of time, a very short period of time, sometimes as little as 60 days to redeem the voucher before it expires. So you both have the time pressure, and then you have you know, 3 out of 4 landlords not accepting them anyway. So even after folks have waited a decade to get a voucher, then they oftentimes end up not being able to utilize them anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just like, this is like a subject dear to my heart right now, because we're, you know, I'm working with a group that's sponsoring a bill to try to like address some of this, but oftentimes this is a form of housing discrimination, like number one. We do have, just so folks know, if in case you're like working with people who are trying to, you know, use their vouchers once they get them after 20 years or 10 years or however long it takes them. But a landlord can't say, no Section 8, I don't accept it, right? So that's unlawful now, but they still are discriminating against, you know, low income people. And so they find other ways to do it. So for example, they'll require a credit check and then say, oh no, like, sorry, your credit's too low, which is like ridiculous because your rent is being paid by the government for the most part, right? So you're like very low risk, but they do that anyway. So there's ways they get around that and continue to discriminate against people. But I think, like Brandon said, this is another area, like we always, if we're going to uphold and fight for the right to things like housing, we always have to be vigilant about the way that like discrimination gets like baked into these programs, and, you know, continually like identify those intersections and, you know, and work on that. KD, are you there?
Yes, but I'm good for this slide though. Thank y'all. I can speak on the next couple slides.
Thank you all. So we wanted to sort of talk about, you know, you're all out in the community, and this is a common issue throughout our state, and that oftentimes you might get information through the news media or through other sources about like quote unquote solutions, and I'm putting these in finger quotes, that are coming from your city council or your county supervisors or other people in decision-making positions. And I think a lot of it oftentimes, like, it sounds pretty good. You're like, okay, like at the outset, that seems like it'll help people. So yeah, let me get behind this. So we want to sort of take part of this next section to talk about what things might seem workable or effective at first, or they might sound really good, but how a lot of programs are not really actually serving long-term needs. And we hope that you take this information and can apply it to things you're saying in the media or things you're seeing from your city council when they're putting these solutions out there, and how to be able to critically think about whether that's an actual long-term permanent solution for the crisis that we are facing. And I will turn it back over to folks. And I think KD, this is where you're going to jump in. And I encourage Diana, if you have thoughts to share here too, around what is, you know, I think most often talked about, our shelter programs and using that as a pathway forward or possible solution.
Yeah.
Can I just start by like giving a brief like overview? So I just want to start by saying one of the things that burns me up more than anything, and it happens all the time, you'll see it in media accounts, you'll see it in the public discourse, especially from public officials and elected officials, but like when they conflate the term housing with shelter. So shelter is not a home, right? And especially congregate shelters are not homes. They're institutional environments. And, I think that if we lived in a world in which long-term solutions, long-term housing was available almost like as an immediate response to people's needs, then a short shelter stay, while you're getting connected housing would be appropriate, right? But I've been doing this work for 7 years, and I know people who have been living in shelters for all of those years because, as we said, real housing is not available. And yet, and leaving people with no choice but to live on the streets, in their cars, or in a shelter, right? Generally. So yes, they can get people off the streets, but we see now, and actually I would love like Brandon to jump in here at some point too, but we see like these aggressive shelter first policies that local jurisdictions are pushing, right? Coming at the expense of long-term housing. And there's reasons that the shelter system is expanding so rapidly right now at the expense of long-term housing. I'm just gonna give you one example. In Orange County, the number of shelter spots since 2015 has increased by 158%. While the number of permanent supportive housing spots, that is affordable, subsidized affordable permanent housing for chronically unhoused individuals with disabilities, our most, vulnerable folks who are out on the streets, has increased by 13%. So that's essentially staying flat, right? So the number of actual, homes for folks with disabilities has increased by 13%, the number of shelter spots by 158%. Meanwhile, chronic houselessness has more than quadrupled over that period of time in Orange County. So it's not working, it's not ending houselessness, right? But it's just sort of like institutionalizing people in essentially generally what they are mass warehouses. And those and segregating them in mass warehouses. So warehouses that are generally also like in industrial areas, not like, in communities around amenities or things like that. Shelters are now actually an arm of the carceral state. Here's where I want to talk about the motivation of local jurisdictions to start expanding their shelter system right now, and an extension of the criminal legal system. And this is because local governments, because of a recent Ninth Circuit decision, now interpret that decision as meaning that they are allowed to criminalize people who are living on the streets, unhoused people, for living in public, so long as they have a shelter spot that they can order them to go into, right? And so the shelter, and so when you talk to folks who encounter law enforcement and who are swept up, in this logic, they say that law enforcement will approach them and say, you go to shelter or you get a citation and you go to jail, right? Yeah. Or you can leave the community, right? So, so that's, I'm just going to name it as a form of forced segregation, which is something that we are absolutely not in favor of. And then, I just also want to say that shelters have not been held to high standards over the years. We're working on that too, but yeah, I did an investigation a few years ago, released a report with some of these findings, but they're often just dangerously unsafe and unsanitary. And like I said, they crowd and segregate. The worst, of them crowd and segregate our most economically distressed community members in substandard spaces. And Brandon talks about this a lot, but I just also want to say, when we're engaged in these kinds of, when we implement these kinds of policies, it's very otherizing, right? It contributes to this narrative that there's something wrong with people, they don't belong in our communities, and instead they belong in these really substandard places that we would never volunteer to live in or want to live in. And yet they have the greatest needs, right? They're the folks in our community with the greatest needs, so they deserve like more services, not less. So this is just like both morally reprehensible, and it's actually a violation of folks' right to housing, because instead of building housing, which would be a permanent solution, we're doing this instead. And so like I invite anybody else on the panel to chime in on this particular issue.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I know for me, who's also formerly homeless, formerly incarcerated, formerly poor, whatever other disadvantaged, low socioeconomic titles we want to throw around, I could wear them all. And so, I mean, really everything that everybody has already said kind of really sums it all up for me. I definitely just wanted to chime in here just to talk a little bit about the shelters being a carceral state and stuff like that. Can we go back to that one slide, please? Yes, thank you so much. So I do agree that we can get a little bit too aggressive with the shelter first policies. And again, these resources, they absolutely lead to long wait lists without any real services. That's true. Shelters definitely are an arm of the carceral state. Most of the shelters that I stayed in looked at just like a prison dorm. So they also have those sort of psychological effects and things like that. And shelters are often dangerous, unsafe. They are unsanitary, they're crowded, and they do segregate folks from the rest of society. But even with all those truths, you know, I still am a believer in all hands on deck when it comes to how we approach folks that's unhoused and people that's looking for, you know, a way back into society, because you know, we find ourselves in those situations for various different reasons. Again, we have homeless youth out there who's escaping various different things that they're escaping. You do have a lot of homeless moms with children out there who are at risk of getting their children took by being on the street, and a shelter bed will stave that off. Again, taking people cars. I've been pulled over homeless when it was clear that I was living in this car. I also had all the necessary license and registration as well. And still the guy found a reason to give me a ticket. And so all these things, you know, had I had been parked in a safe parking space area, maybe that would have saved me that $350 on that ticket. And so, you know, I do feel like we do need to move away from aggressive shelter first policies, especially when they fall short. Diana and Lethal mentioned this earlier. These programs can be effective when they are also coupled with self-sufficiency support type systems. We mentioned job training programs for people, transitional work programs that people will be hooked up with at the shelter. Housing. When I was at the shelters, I never once talked to a housing specialist. Not one time did anyone come see me about the next step. And that's where we fall short. The shelter I was in, was allowing, they were taking people's social security checks and SSI checks in exchange for this bed. Again, I ran into people that was living in here 2-3 years based off this exchange. And so again, that's not offering those folks a path to permanent, affordable, supportive housing. And so I feel like the shelter systems, our encampment communities, the way we approach them, folks living at these, folks that are able to have access to maybe a safe parking structure, they fall short when they're not coupled with with a follow-up and a follow-through. Jobs, financial literacy, again, folks that's going through substance use and substance abuse and stuff like that, they need to be followed up with the appropriate next steps, not just leaving folks in the shelters, again, for however long I can stay there, or giving me the shelter system I was in, you got a 90-day bed. What am I gonna do in 90 days that's gonna allow me to take the next step? And so, you know, that's really what I wanted to tie in, is that I'm a fan of all hands on deck when it comes to approaching the solution. I can't advocate to do away with one over the other. I will advocate for reassessing where this money is supposed to be going. I saw someone put in the chat, the business of poverty. Yeah, we call that poverty pimping. Now you're just cycling me around. So from one wait list to the next, I'm waiting 11 years to get the voucher. When I get the voucher, I can't use it because I got the 60 days. I done lost the voucher. Now I'm back on the wait list. Yeah, those are the cycles and the circles that we do get caught up in. And until we are able to really tie all the programs that we have available to us now until those next steps, those self-sufficiency steps and programs, yeah, we will continue to have this cycle of poverty pimping going on. And I'll yield it there just in case if someone else wanted to chime in, because I know we're starting to run short on time.
I guess I just want to add one small statement. And I guess the thing I would want people to understand as well is the shelters we have, the safe grounds we have right now are not what the communities who fought for them envisioned, right? And when we talk about these aggressive shelter first policies, we're talking about this stripped down, weaponized version of what we had hoped for. And so a lot of those that are still talking about shelter first or safe ground stakes down, we're not talking about what's available. What we want doesn't even exist anymore, right? There's high barriers and there is unsafe conditions like everyone has talked about. What we're talking about is something that's kind of bridging the two in the same way that Katie was talking about as well. And I guess I would hope that people that are keeping their ear out understand that even if you're hearing this on the news, like, oh, we have this program, to dig deeply and ask whether that program actually reflects what the communities that were fighting for them wanted, or if you're receiving something very stripped down and limited and problematic. Yeah.
Thanks to both of you. And the one thing that the only thing I would add, and kind of like just a follow-up to what KD was like expressing about her experiences, is that I think the reason that she never, talked to her housing person is that housing wasn't there, right? And that's just like, I think what I want to reinforce is that through the anecdote that I shared, right? And like just the history of our disinvestment in affordable housing is that we don't think that it's humane for people to live like the rest of their lives or long chunks of their lives in shelters. That if we believe in the right to housing, we have to invest in that. And what we're seeing is we are not seeing those investments, right? So it's the missing piece of the puzzle ever since our current houselessness crisis sort of like emerged in the 1980s, like contemporary houselessness, right? It's always been the missing piece of the puzzle. And so if we really want to keep our eyes on the prize in terms of the vision that Tammy started with, of a future in which we all have a safe, affordable place to live, to raise our families. I saw one person comment in here and say, shelters are not a good place for families with children. They get their children taken away. That's very true in Orange County. I mean, I kept getting intakes from people who are saying, my kid like ran into the wrong area and the staff called Child Protective Services and now there's a case on me and, I'm going to lose my kids. Right. So it's not a good place to raise families. It's just, it's not a permanent solution. And yet it's the only thing that is available to folks, at the moment, for the most part, unless you wait and wait and wait. So that's why we sort of focus on, the right to housing and actually how we're going to get there.
But I would just say that from a legal and policy perspective, these things are actually have very real impact. So the current legal framework that we and others who litigate around these issues have been litigating around is the Martin v. Boise case, which essentially says that a city can't criminalize or enforce laws as it relates to people standing, sitting, lying, etc., if they don't have enough shelter beds. So if the number of unhoused people outnumber the number of shelter beds, for example, then these sorts of things can be seen as unlawful if enforced. The practical impact of that could be that, instead of investing in more permanent housing, that as a way to enforce these ordinances that criminalize people being, that there's more temporary, shelter beds established. There's also inherent in that, in some of the different advocacy and some of the different judicial rulings along these issues, is this idea of whether or not people are refusing shelter, for example. So whether or not someone has a pet, a dog, etc., and they are offered a shelter bed and a shelter that does not allow animals, if they are seen as refusing shelter, then that could have ramifications. The same could be seen for different familial relationships, and the shelter might not be adequate for that, or insert sort of scenario, which is while for a temporary solution, shelters are helpful as a first step, and also can be harmful insofar as people are denied or they're not adequate to meet people's needs. And then because they're not adequate to meet people's needs, then people are seen as refusing shelter, which can actually have ramifications in terms of furthering the criminalization, the stigmatization, and the sort of alienation that comes with it. And so it's a sort of nuanced perspective, but also why we and many of our coalition partners have been approaching things from a housing first standpoint. I saw someone in the chat mention something about care court, which for those who don't know is the proposal by the governor to essentially have a sort of process in place for folks who have or are seen to have severe sort of mental health issues can be, from our perspective, coerced into services, or coerced and put into sorry, my son's making a bunch of noise in the background, into institutions, essentially. And that is something that ourselves and some of our partners at Western Center and others have come out against. And as I mentioned, which is true in almost all of these issues, is also a issue that disproportionately impacts Black folks and other people of color, where they are more likely to be wrongly diagnosed with schizophrenia and other sort of severe mental health issues, which could then thrust them into sort of further institutionalization via this sort of care court framework. And so that is something that us and our partners are continuing to oppose.
I think those are such good points. And just like to underscore one thing that Brandon said, which was so important. You led us through the whole Martin v. Boise logic and like much better than I did in terms of like, you know, how these shelters have become sort of a part and parcel of our criminal legal system right now that discriminates against and criminalizes unhoused people. And actually at that point, this really disempowers people who are unhoused because they can't really even vote with their feet, right? If the shelter conditions are dangerous for you, if it would result in the deterioration of your mental or physical health to stay in a shelter, you really cannot choose to. Your only other option would be to live outside right now, and it's difficult to make that choice because law enforcement is going to arrest you, right? So there's this incredible power imbalance between the shelter and the resident, and in part it helps explain the really substandard conditions, because instead of, you know, meeting the needs of folks, they can sort of like not meet their needs and get away with it, since the people that they're serving have so little power in that situation. But thanks for that really articulate explanation, Brandon.
Thank you all. I've been seeing reading lots of comments in the chat of like, okay, but I want to do something. What can I do? And so we did want to provide folks with a few ideas, and then I welcome the other panelists to chime in. I think ultimately what it comes down to is reinvesting funding into what actually works. It sort of sounds simple because it's pretty simple. It's just the fact that we haven't done it. At this point, most discretionary funding in our cities and our counties goes to law enforcement, which in turn goes into policing folks who are unhoused or who are experiencing poverty. And I think Eve said this to me, and it's sort of crystallized in my mind of like, not only is having law enforcement respond in cases of folks who are unhoused, dangerous and violent, it's probably also the most ineffective pathway to actually finding a solution. So as part of this, we're heading into budget advocacy season in the next few months. We encourage you to learn about your local people's budget movement, which generally advocates for funding for community-based solutions and programming. And then I invite the rest of the panel. I think there was a question here, sort of a question from two people, but I know that it was lifted up here from Nelson around like, could the panel please discuss what the legislative pipeline and what state legislators, if any, are trying to help these issues the unhoused are facing? Which local cities or counties are producing the best model of help? And I think many of us are in meetings with our state legislators next week, and so that's on the mind. But if the panel has any thoughts in response to that question as well.
I just want to like start by saying, in addition to that, and I think that's right, like whoever said, you know, like let's pay attention to opportunities at the state level. I think we still need to really push our state legislators to, you know, come up with to support real solutions in a way that's actually going to make a difference, right? Our state legislatures tend to love like one-time funding, you know, like throw a little bit of money at the situation, but you know, once that tiny fraction of folks are housed, right? Now what? We need to push our state legislatures for long-term sustainable funding, which is going to require tax equity, a more equitable tax structure, which, you know, our state legislatures are going to need. They're going to need a lot of encouragement and a lot of pressure, you know, in order to go in that direction. And just like, I'm just gonna like say it because they're in the pockets of the donor, you know, class, which sincerely just likes things the way that they are. So so we need people power. This is, like I said before, a political issue. It requires a political solution. Because we don't have like really powerful interest groups, you know, backing us up. We don't have the donor class backing us up. We need people power. So we really do need everyone to get involved. And then that brings me to my second point, which is that we need to be like, if I just think if you take anything away from this presentation, it is the narrative shift that we have to engage in. We need to be educating our friends, our neighbors, you know, the people we work with, our colleagues, about the reality of the situation, the real cause of like houselessness and housing insecurity, and the real solution, because the dominant discourse blames unhoused people for, you know, having like whatever, like substance abuse conditions, like whatever it is, resisting services, right? Like not just like not getting with the program. That's individualizing what is obviously like a historical structural issue, an issue of economic justice and structural violence and racial violence and gendered violence and LGBTQ violence. And we need to address it we need to understand it that way and address it that way. And right now, I can tell you that the majority of people, even people who identify as progressives, don't really understand that. So public education and narrative shifting is like a huge part of our job, and we can all engage in that.
I mean, I would just say, I mean, to be honest, there's probably far more bills that are problematic that are having to be opposed and are helpful. I mean, there's a couple. AB 2775 would allow for a waiver of DMV registration fees for folks who verify annually that they are houseless and utilizing their automobile recreational vehicle as their primary residence. This is helpful. It's clearly not a solution, but we've been suing several jurisdictions over RV bans, and you know, a lot of my work is on decriminalization of poverty, which includes parking tickets, towing, fines and fees, et cetera. So these things go a long way in terms of that, particularly because some of these jurisdictions that are carving out things like safe parking programs for RVs require those vehicles to be registered. And if you get parking tickets, but you can't afford to pay those parking tickets, those get added to your vehicle registration. And so you can't register your vehicle. This obviously would not help the issue that dovetails with that, which is vehicle maintenance, for example, which also ends up being a issue for vehicularly housed folks who can't keep up the maintenance or can't get their vehicle smogged, et cetera. And so, you know, it'll be helpful. It doesn't go as far, but, you know, every little bit helps. But then there's, on the flip side, are other bills that are happening. One which would sort of make it so that after 72 hours notice, people can be expelled from places that are classified as special parks, which could be parks that have recreational stuff. So it is something like a baseball diamond. It could be parks that have, you know, wildlife that is set to be protected or should be protected, and has provisions such as, you know, again, with 72-hour notice, you can be pushed out, or you can have be swept, right? And so these sorts of things, when we know that people are already being pushed out of sort of urban centers because of the no sit, stand, lay sort of laws, pushes folks to parks, right, and other places. So this would allow for sort of push out even further, right? You know, some folks in LA going underground and other things like that. So there's a lot more personal, I mean, a lot more sort of problematic things on the horizon that we're kind of having to like combat and oppose than things that are helpful at the moment. But Yeah, we'll see. I mean,
I'll give one like little ray of light, because I agree, folks, we're fighting defense right now. So we need we need like people power with that, like, you know, keep track of the bills that the ACLU of California is opposing as well as supporting. Keep an eye on State Constitutional Amendment 9, which would create a right to housing in California. And it got introduced this year. It'll come back next year. It would be a good bill to just sort of like mobilize around in terms of this housing first movement and, you know, a future in which we actually one day achieve the right to housing. And that's by Gonzalez.
Something I quickly wanted to just add in before I have to go. One thing that I've seen in my specific, you know, county and cities that I've been in is, and I would warn people, is that sometimes a lot of these different policies that are being pushed for, when they finally make it to voting, they sometimes are inserted with these hidden elements. And I guess I want to ask people to just be really aware of looking into each of these policies, because sometimes they co-opt them, right? And I think that that's a big danger that I kept seeing over and over in Sac County, is our policies being co-opted and layered, and people just voted on them assuming that's what was the best for the community, not knowing that they had been changed. And so that's my 2 cents of just like, yeah, try to check into who's actually supporting the policy, not just like what the wording seems like. But I'm gonna thank you for your time, and I'm gonna have to go.
Yes, go ahead, Diana. We really
Thank
appreciate
you, Diana.
staying this long.
And I know that there were a lot of questions and commentary into the chat. We had such a robust discussion here that I fear we talked a little bit about solutions and potentially legislative solutions, but did not get to everyone's questions in the chat. So we will save the chat, and maybe our team can also review those. And I think that there were probably some commonly asked questions from all of you in the chat, and we can use those, I think, for our team to consider. And I would love to, you know, utilize our discussion today and maybe figure out whether there's like ways that we can follow up with you, or, you know, as you're engaging in these conversations with your networks, like if there's commonly asked questions and we should create something that sort of dispels myths, I think that that could be a great resource for you all as well too. So in the interest of respecting everyone's time, I just wanted to quickly go over some of what is happening right around the corner starting next week. So a lot of folks who are here today are going to be meeting with your state legislators to advocate for bills beginning next week. And our resource page is full of additional materials. Luis just put that into the chat, so we encourage you to check that out if you're lobbying, or even if you're not lobbying. It includes a lot of helpful information. If you have any questions about your lobbying meetings or what the schedule is for next week, we encourage you to join our Q&A sessions, which are Monday at either noon or 5:30. Our lobby visits will be taking place between Tuesday and Thursday. We have text banks on Tuesday and Wednesday at noon, and then our closing celebration is Thursday at 5:30. And then keep us posted. You can, I'll put this in email into the chat box. You can email us at changemakers at aclunc.org with any questions. And I just wanted to thank all of our panelists who are here today. I think Lethal and Diana already had to drop off, but thank you to you all for being here, and thank you to our panelists. And we'll follow up with slides and additional information as you engage in this work in your community. So thank you.
And just on the CARES Act stuff, folks can see the tweet from that on ACLU Northern California's Twitter feed, which also links to the sign-on letter that us and others have joined.
Yeah, we can include that in a follow-up email, Brandon. That's a great idea. Thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon and a good weekend.